Not only was the teacher wise, but he imparted knowledge to the people. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Thank you. You may be seated.
Not everyone in the Jeppe community knew that David Quail taught at King Edward VII School for 7 years before he came to teach at Jeppe. I knew the Quails through my connection at King Edward's as a boy and as a teacher, and I now teach at Jeppe, so it was thought that this would kind of fit if I handled this event. The King Edward School magazine for 1959 notes that one of the 2 members of staff that year was Mr. Quail, Latin and history. His nickname amongst the King Edward's boys was Birdie Quail. I'm a bit surprised that that nickname seems not to have caught on at Jeppe. Maybe it did. Apparently his nickname at Jeppe was Batman, because he wore the headmaster's gown of office throughout the day. In the 1960 Kes magazine, the head prefect of Schoolhouse, where David was a boarding master, wrote that, "We are at a loss of words to report that Mr. Birdie Quail has been hooked and is feathering his nest. We extend to both himself and Miss Claire Brotherton our heartiest congratulations." And Claire remembers that we loved our time at Kes. We had no children at that stage, so I could watch under-14 cricket and rugby matches. And according to the 1960 magazine, the under-14 rugby teams, quote, "did not have the most brilliant players, but they were nevertheless most enthusiastic and hard-playing." Now that's schoolmaster rugby coach code for a bad season, a very bad season. The under-14A won only 1 match in 1960. That must have been hard to take for a competitive young schoolmaster like David Quail. However, his under-14A cricket team won 10 out of 13. Now, the family have asked me to read a tribute on their behalf, and of course, especially welcome here today are Claire. She and David recently celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary. Their daughter Julia Hinton, their son Jonathan and his wife Deborah, and their son Gabriel. Their brother Doug could not be here today. Michael Quail, David's brother and a Jeppe old boy. Ken, Bev and Rob Barker, David's cousins and Jeppe old boys. Claire's cousin Wendy and Doug Barrow. And Daisy Hornsby and Edgar and Linda Brotherton up from the Eastern Cape. Welcome to you all on this special day for Jeppe. So here is the family's tribute. Thank you to the headmaster, Brendan Gittins, and the school for hosting this memorial, and to all the old boys for their heartwarming tributes to David and his life's work. David's passion for the school he was a boy at, taught at, and served as headmaster was an unstoppable driving force, which we simply knew we had to embrace. But he included us on the Jeppe journey, with Claire spending many Saturday afternoons watching rugby while the kids played squash at the new courts, one of the first projects he'd set out to achieve as headmaster. We are so grateful to all of you for your enormous support, shared memories and good wishes. Thank you to all who are here from far and wide and attending by streaming to celebrate his life at Jeppe, in the squash world, and as a politician, where he carried on holding the banner for education. Our Eastern Cape family, who are here today, gave a beautiful tribute. isiXhosas have a saying, "The big tree in the forest has fallen." This describes Dave. His son Jonathan was talking to me just before we came in, and he said he was so pleased to have been able to have a walk with his dad not long before he died. They used to run together, and of course Dave was a great athlete, and now he entered what one of the classical scholars calls the grey and brittle years. And he was only able to walk with difficulty with his walker, but he battled his way around the garden a couple of times with Jonathan. He wasn't really able to speak. But Jonathan said he was determined, he never gave up, And towards the end of their little walk, he raised his hand, put it on Jonathan's shoulder as an acknowledgement and gesture of love. So, from the family to a beloved husband, father, and grandfather, may you rest in peace. And we received this tribute via Claire from Tony Leon, former DA leader and leader of the opposition in Parliament. I very much regret I am unable to be present in person today, and am honoured by the request of the Quail family to offer tribute to David Quail. Exactly 40 years ago, in February 1986, I first entered the Quail household in Norwood. Back then, I was a 20-something, just elected Johannesburg City Councillor, and Claire Quail was both a benchmate and soon enough proved to be a kindred soul and trusted friend. One of the many advantages of my friendship with Claire was that it disproved the US President Harry Truman's adage, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. Not that there was a shortage of canines in the Quail household, but Claire's generous hospitality and famous warmth also allowed access and introductions to David, Julie, Jonathan, and Doug. David proved at first meeting and evolving over the decades following to be the sort of person that all the handsome tributes praising his long and very well-lived life have captured so well. He had a passion for education, reason, sport, reading, liberal idealism, and a clear understanding of human imperfection, for which sometimes he had a low tolerance. He was shaped by the school, Jeppe High School for Boys, and David's storied headmastership in turn profoundly shaped and improved the school. I soon discovered that beneath his steely gaze and disciplined manner was a person of warmth and engagement. And if I hazard one guess, first observed so many years back to account for David's life of purpose and indeed his longevity, it was his rigor, both physical and intellectual, coupled with enthusiasm and curiosity, and an infectious laugh, aided by copious glasses of wine that he offered and shared with his guests. Because of Claire's immersion and dedication to politics and deep commitment to the PFP and its successors, it was hardly surprising that her most committed supporter and election helpmate would follow her into a political career of his own. David's decade in political office and in pursuing and pioneering educational reform and excellence in Gauteng province was not born of political expediency or a demand for headlines. It was the result of his own decades of hinterland and expertise that he brought to the political realm. He had first-hand knowledge of achieving extraordinary results in and from government schools, and he was able to apply his academic background and practical school leadership to the often dysfunctional and highly ideological landscape of modern Gauteng. It was entirely of a piece with the rest of David's life and career that after he left office, he immersed himself in the leadership of the party in the Houghton constituency, the very place where he and Claire, supporting me enthusiastically, where I was first elected to Parliament back in 1989. My life, political and personal, has for 40 years been entwined with the Quails. And now, like everyone gathered today, the family, friends, and many former colleagues, we now, with sadness but deep appreciation, journey on without David's divining presence in our midst. The Jews have an apt saying at an event such as today: may his memory be a blessing. Thank you, David. We are blessed by your memory indeed. Tony Leon's tribute. I now invite the school choir under the direction of Mr. Seppo Olifant to pay their tribute. Well, we're not in church, but even if we were, we can clap. And I think another round of applause for our choir. I think David would have been delighted to see the choir here today. In David's final year at school, he played for the first 15 at Jeppe, which produced the school's second unbeaten season, including a record 20-6 win over King Edward's. In the school magazine, he was described as having good hands, a good eye for a gap, and who runs strongly, very good tackler. He also played for the first cricket team. Teaching at Jeppe, he was the coach of the 1967 first rugby team that had an outstanding season, losing only to Dale College in their final fixture. Of course, rugby was close to his heart, but so was Jeppe and the values it stands for. And no account of David's life as a headmaster would be complete without the James Dalton affair. For those of you who don't know about it, can't be too many of you, in 1990 was the school's 100th anniversary, centenary, and Dalton, during the match against Athlone Boys High, got into trouble. There was a near riot involving supporters and players, and Dalton was sent off. And the penalty was a one-match suspension. And the trouble was that the next match was against King Edward's, and it was the big centenary game. And David Quail said he's suspended, he can't play. The school went on strike. And there are various accounts of this. Some of them, I think, have grown bigger in the telling. But for several days, it seems, the school sat on the fields and refused to go to school. And eventually there was mediation and so on. And Jake White, who was the coach at the time, later the Springbok coach, he said he must have had 20 phone calls from schools offering to play Jeppe on the Wednesday so that Dalton could serve his suspension and then play against King Edward's on the Saturday. Now, as you can imagine, this appealed tremendously to the boys, to the old boys, and probably most of the staff. And David Quail said, no, it's not in the spirit of what's happened. And eventually they negotiated, and Dalton himself appealed to the school, and he didn't play, and the match went ahead, which King Edward's won. And there was a lot of I told you so around that. But Jeppe then won the return fixture later in the year, so honour was satisfied in their centenary year. Must have been difficult for David Quail to have taken the decision on principle rather than favour a rugby solution, but he did. He loved his sport and he knew the value of an all-round education, blending academics, sport, cultural activities. But he did draw the line. And Claire tells the story of how John Hurry, a King Edward's staff member and good friend, was forced to take Claire to the ballet at the Civic Theatre because David Quail refused to go. Yes, he was a successful rugby man, but squash was really his game. Doug Barrow is an old Johannian who, with his brother David, made up the Barrow brothers, who was such a formidable force for years in South African squash. Doug achieved Springbok colours a few years before David, his great lifelong friend and very fierce opponent in club squash in Johannesburg, Doug Barrow.
As David said, David had a great love for sport, and we shared many occasions watching the Springbok rugby team together through both victory and defeat. At a more local level, there was always plenty to discuss after a Jeppe versus St. John's rugby clash. In his later years, David often spoke fondly of winning a squash tournament in Settlers in the Limpopo province, where he was a schoolboy. I'm still trying to verify this particular win, but David certainly was a very good tennis player as a youngster. It was squash, however, that brought us together. There were many tough tussles between old Edwardians, with Graham MacDonald and David Quail ranked numbers 1 and 2, and the old Johannians with my brother David and myself in those positions. The old Ed's team in those days also included the same John Hurry who took Claire to the ballet, and Simon Malone. I believe that it was John Hurry who persuaded and encouraged David to give squash his full commitment. It was not long before David was selected to play for Transvaal at the annual Jarvis Cup interprovincial tournament. A fierce and determined competitor on the squash court, he quickly progressed, and before long was knocking on the door for Springbok honours. It was probably his great determination which took him up the ladder, and it was in fact a remarkable achievement that he should be selected to play for South Africa at the age of 36. It was in 1972 that David toured the United Kingdom with the Springbok team that included Davie Botha, Roland Watson, Steve Sherrin, and Keith Coppin. This tour, which featured a 3-test series against Great Britain, was undoubtedly the highlight of David's playing career. In any sport, this would be a very special event, being selected for your country to tour Great Britain and playing in a test series against GB. Thereafter, David continued to compete at a high level, and during the 1980s, he won several South African veterans titles, further testament to his skill and commitment to the game. Alongside his playing career, David had already begun coaching. It soon became clear that coaching would occupy much of his time, both locally and around the country. During this period, he was appointed convener of the coaching committee of the Squash Rackets Association of Southern Africa. His administrative responsibilities continued to grow, and it was not long before he was appointed chairman of the SRA of SA, a position he held for 8 years. This was a particularly active era for squash in South Africa, and David also served as manager of South African teams at 2 World Championships, and he was also a national selector. Looking back on David's life, it is quite remarkable how fully he dedicated himself to serving the community through education, local politics, and squash administration. Added to this was the personal achievement of earning Springbok colours and securing his place in the distinguished list of Jeppe High School for Boys international sportsmen. We were fortunate to spend time with David during his final days, and although he was somewhat confused, I have no doubt that he was enormously content and satisfied with the great race he had run. Thank you.
With us today as well is Professor Graham Hall, a distinguished former rector of the Johannesburg College of Education, or JCE as it was known. He was a contemporary of David Quail at Jeppe in the 1950s. They taught at the school together in the 1960s. They were lecturers at JCE in the 1970s. Graham served on the Jeppe school governing body during David's headmastership, and as rector of JCE, Graham asked David on his retirement to join the staff of JCE. So I think they knew each other pretty well. Graham Hall.
Mrs. Claire Quail, members of the Quail family, headmaster, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to pay tribute this afternoon to David Quail's contribution to Jeppe High School and to highlight many of his other achievements in education. There'd always been a close connection between the Quail family and the Jeppe schools. In 1937, shortly after David was born, his father enrolled him at Jeppe, and that is how, in 1950, he arrived to be a boarder at Sesebe, having completed his primary education at Zebedelia Farm School and the Lord Milner Primary School. The next 5 years here at Jeppe were influential in forming the close bond between David and the school. David excelled academically, was in the first rugby team, was a senior cadet officer and head prefect. On leaving school, he followed his father's advice and joined a Johannesburg firm of accountants, but that only lasted a short while before registering at Wits and the Johannesburg College of Education to train as a teacher. He completed a BA degree majoring in Latin and history, followed by a postgraduate teaching qualification. His innate leadership qualities resulted in him chairing the Student Representative Council and in him being awarded the senior award, the Hutton Memorial Scholarship. David started teaching Latin and history at King Edward VII School, and having been awarded a Whitmore Richards Travelling Scholarship, he spent a year teaching at Repton College, a leading British school in Derbyshire. His time at Repton confirmed his belief in the merits of academic excellence combined with sporting and extracurricular participation, best summed up in the Latin proverb, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body. In 1966, David was appointed as head of the Latin department here at JEPI, and his time teaching at the school was very successful, as you've heard, both in the classroom and as a coach of the first rugby team. His teaching of Latin was characterized by his insistence on a sound foundation in Latin grammar, combined with an informative and sensitive handling of the way the Roman civilization founded our Western democracies. David completed a B.Ed honours, and it was only a matter of time before he was seconded as a lecturer to JCE. Student teachers appreciated his ability to relate educational theory to classroom situations. The retirement in 1978 of Mr. Haldane Hofmeyer resulted in David applying for and being appointed as the 13th headmaster of JEPI. David led JEPI for almost 2 decades that saw the greatest societal and political change in the country's history. Change from restrictive admissions policy to the admission of boys of all races. Change from education system dominated by narrow political agenda to a more open and just dispensation. No headmaster, past, present or future, had or will have had to leave the school through such changes. Schools are not exempt from external political influences, but JEPI was able to accept and indeed welcome these changes is, in no small measure, a tribute to David's belief in the necessity for the change, but also in his calm authority and personal integrity. It's difficult for me to cover all of David's considerable achievements, but a few changes stand out. Changes in the assessment policy of the school with the introduction of bi-weekly cycle testing. The rewarding of academic excellence with the introduction of academic colours, the introduction of Zulu as an additional language, the restructuring of the school day ending at 2 p.m. and not 2:50, the increase in the enrollment considerable from 750 to over 1,000, the expansion of school property with expropriation of houses in Highland Road and 8 houses down McDonald Street. He drove the centenary celebration in 1990 and culminated in the purchase of the Centenary House. The incorporation of Rowan and Tabana as school boarding houses situated for the first time on the school property. At the start of his headship, the school fees were 48 Rand, not per month, not per term, but per year, giving an annual budget of a little over 40,000 Rand. When he retired nearly 20 years later, the budget was over 4 million Rand, and that, if you include the boarding houses, over 6 million Rand. In 1992, JEPI was classified as a Model C school, giving greater powers to the school governing body. and it was reclassified as a quintile 5 school. Both these decisions resulted in the school having to raise a considerable sum of money in school fees and in donations. Otherwise, it just couldn't operate. It was David, supported by the school governing body, who had to cope with these far-reaching changes. As headmaster, his actions were always guided by his steadfast belief in the values that the school stood for. He enjoyed the support of loyal teachers who respected his calm authority, and he was encouraged by the respect shown by the learners, respect because they were certain of his dedication to their best interest. David was offered senior positions in the Inspectorate and in the Transvaal Education Department's head office in Pretoria, positions he declined because he believed he still had much to do at JEPI, and because he was opposed to the policy of excluding learners on racial grounds. From 1992, JEPI was able to enroll learners irrespective of their racial backgrounds. And hearing Kevin read the school prayer, I'm reminded of his address in the opening assembly in 1993, when he reminded the learners of the significance within the South African context of the opening lines of the school prayer. O God, who is made of one blood, all nations of men, mercifully receive the prayers we offer for our anxious and troubled world. Send thy light into the darkness and guide the nations as one family into the ways of peace. David retired after his 60th birthday in 1997, but he still had much to offer education. He joined the staff of JCE, and in the following year, he was appointed as consultant for the government in their attempt to develop rural schools, an experience that gave David an insight into the lack of quality education faced by rural communities. Given his wealth of educational experience, it was inevitable that he would be elected as the Democratic Party spokesperson on education in the government provincial legislature, a position that he held for 10 years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it would be remiss of me if I did not acknowledge the devoted support that his wife Claire and his family gave David. Claire, without your support and your love, much of what David achieved would simply not have been possible. In summary, David Quail served education with distinction, with humility, and with unwavering principle. Those who worked with David remember him for his calm authority and generous disposition. As headmaster, he led with integrity and courage at a time of unprecedented transition, ensuring that the standards and values were upheld while opening JEPI's doors wider to equity and opportunity. He believed deeply in the power of teachers to shape society, and he devoted much of his time as headmaster to preparing JEPI boys to be thoughtful, honest, and critical members of society. The Quail family has a motto. It's appropriately a Latin motto, Ero quale spiro. I will become the kind of man I hope to be. David's contribution to this school and to education lived up to and far exceeded the expectation of the family motto. His association with JEPI High School lasted for 6 decades. After his retirement, his legacy lived on. It lived on in the lives of hundreds of JEPI boys he influenced, and it lives to this day in the enduring foundations that he laid for successive headmasters to build upon. Thank you.
Hearing Graham talk about that difficult period between the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was an extraordinary time for South Africa, but especially for schools. In the 1980s, there were states of emergency. Apartheid was rigidly enforced. Schools were all white. And sometimes the boys say, so why are all these photographs full of white boys? Because they were full of white boys until the 1990s. It was an extraordinary achievement, like working on an aeroplane while it's flying, to change the schools, to change admissions, to deal with a constituency of parents who were understandably nervous about change, and maintain standards, and raise money. And it struck me that there was a generation of headmasters. David Quail was one of them, Bruce McMurray at King Edward's, Malcolm Armstrong at Pretoria, who had been headmasters for about 10 years. And they were equipped to deal with the massive challenge of that transition. Many other schools were not, and they fell by the wayside. I once chaired a headmasters' conference of the boys' schools, and at it was Franklin Son, who you may remember was ambassador to the United States and director of the Peninsula Technikon. And he was talking to the assembled 25 or so headmasters of the great public boys' schools. And he stopped and he departed from what he was going to say, and he said, you know, I've just realized, and there was, tears started coming down his face. He said, you men have achieved a miracle. Claire remembers that David loved being at JCE. She says he was enormously intellectually stimulated by the many wonderful staff. And after a few weeks there, he commented that many of the women students were attractive, but they didn't wear lipstick. I decided, said Claire, this was a hint for me. So I stopped using lipstick, which didn't meet with his approval at all. So I gave up trying to compete with 20-year-olds. I just want to say to you now that there will be refreshments in the Payne Hall just across the quadrangle outside after this event. And after the headmaster has addressed you, the pipe band will pay their tribute, followed by the closing school prayer read by Mr. Dale Jackson. I now call upon the headmaster of Jeppe High School for Boys, Mr. Brendan Gittens.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Good afternoon, the Quail family, former Jeppe headmasters, Tate, Dempsey, and Jackson. That's all 4 living headmasters if you include myself, which is quite remarkable. Good afternoon to the old boys, in particular our JBA chairman, Mr. Jonathan Hervitz, who represents our old boys, to staff of Jeppe High School for Boys and ex-staff of Jeppe High School for Boys who are here, and the many, many friends from other schools, and of course the guests and our boys. I had barely taken office as the 17th headmaster of Jeppe High School for Boys when one evening, just before my first day actually, I received a call from my own headmaster as a boy, Mr. Kevin Tate. He phoned me to tell me that Mr. Quail had passed away. Quite a way to begin a headship. In that moment, I understood 3 things very clearly. Number 1, that our community needed to know, and they needed to know urgently. I also realized very quickly that an unthinkable number of people would be affected by this loss. Those who knew him only indirectly, but understood his impact. Those who encountered him briefly, but would never forget him. And the thousands and thousands who were shaped directly by him as a man and as an educator. And of course, the Jeppe community itself is a large one. It's also a very passionate one, as we can see sometimes with the comments after the King Edward's game. And it's a very emotional one. We honor our own. We love our own. And even those who never met David Quail felt the loss, his loss, or the loss, should I say, and appreciated him and his contribution to our school greatly. Second, I understood and realized that the loss reached far beyond Jeppe. And third, I understood that we needed to honor him. It felt as though a giant on whose shoulders Jeppe has stood for decades had gone. The timing of Mr. Quail's death was remarkable from a personal point of view. As a relatively young man, on the eve of taking up my first headship, I was a similar age to Mr. Quail when he was contemplating his first headship. As you can imagine, my mind had been racing in the months leading up to this role, which started in January. Claire, David's wife, of course, was kind enough in our conversations to send me some of the notes and the writings about his life and education. I also happened to look at a couple of his old school magazines. As I read through his journey, much of which has been detailed by the speakers, I read about his years as a Jeppe boy, I read about his time as a young teacher, and I read about his years as a headmaster with special interest, of course. I realized what an extraordinary gift this was to me on the eve that I was to take office. I was profoundly impacted by it. Thank you, Claire, for sharing that with me. It was preparation. It was context and history of our great school, and it was guidance and words of counsel to a young headmaster. In those first few days of my headship, my thoughts, my words, my ideals, my values, all of which were already inside of me, became very, very clear. Through reflecting on David Quail, I came to understand Jeppe far, far more deeply than ever before. A school that I thought I truly understood well, I learned more about. The Jeppe I inherited just a month ago has Quail written all over it. In the values that matter so deeply to us, in the shape of the campus, as we've heard, in the reasons why we do things the way we do things at Jeppe, and most importantly, in the very soul of this remarkable place. David Quail planted seeds at Jeppe that grew strong and enduring, trees under which he would never himself sit, but under which generations would find shade. His influence on his successor, Kevin Tate, was profound and would have impacted the work of Mr. Tate as head. And that influence carried further still. Two of his head boys stand as very clear examples of that. One was Robert Katzen, who carried Jeppe in his heart long after leaving the school, becoming a formidable force in the formation of the Jeppe Boys Association and a driving influence behind many of the school's improvements that you've seen over the last 10 or 20 years. And even today, Rob, who is here, is nothing but supportive of the school, and in particular, me as a head. The other head boy that I example was Dale Jackson, who inherited a Jeppe shaped deeply by Quail, and who went on to add meaningfully to the story himself. Dale's love for this school runs deep, as we all know. And Quail was there, sometimes in person, but I think mostly in his heart during his headship. Quail was in Dale's thinking, it was in his standards, and most of all, I think it was in his sense of responsibility. He took up the canvas that Quail had originally left, and he continued to paint upon it. And so often happens between head boys and headmasters, the two men would be tied for life, but perhaps even more so because of the extraordinary events of 1990 that David Williams has spoken about. Of course, won't repeat what happened, but I think it's worth noting that both Dale Jackson and David Quail would have had a particularly difficult week as head boy and headmaster that week, as we heard. What strikes me, though, and David did allude to it, was the message was unmistakable from David Quail. No Jeppe boy will ever be bigger than the school. No Jeppe boy, regardless of who he is, will escape the expectations of behavior, character, and accountability. Dalton, of course, is a beloved son of our school, but Quail would not budge, as we heard. That Jeppe, in my opinion, still exists today, in no small measure because of the moral fiber and the integrity and the courage and ethical clarity of a person like David Quail. I can only hope and aspire that when faced with moments of real difficulty like that, I might show the same kind of courage that Mr. Quail showed, the same moral fortitude, the same unwavering commitment to what is right, Dare I say, even if it means losing to King Edward's. Mr. Quail's tributes speak repeatedly of his integrity and repeatedly of his moral clarity. One of the great joys of being headmaster in the last month was I was to receive many, many, many tributes across many different platforms in honor of David Quail from all over the world. There is a deep and enduring respect for JP's beloved Batman. He was strict, as Mr. Blanks, who's in the audience, will often tell me. But boys need that, and Roland needed that in particular. Boys need headmasters to form boundaries. But he was also exceptionally intelligent, thoughtful, and understanding. Professor Hall has already illustrated the many successes of his tenure. I wish I could count all the tributes that come in, and Claire, I'm still trying to figure out how to compact that for you and your family. But it was relentless. They came in and they poured in from all over the world, and I know many are watching online now as well. To the whole Quail family, his life has had an exceptional impact. It is fitting that two headmasters have also read the prayers today, former headmasters. As I said, Mr. Dempsey is here as well, but I thought fitting that his successor and that his head boy would end with those prayers. Prof. Hall spoke about the deep meaning of those prayers, and on my very first assembly at JP this year, I reminded the boys of Quail's thoughts about those prayers as well. I would like to extend some thanks, as I should do as headmaster, firstly to Mr. Williams, David, who actually is a staff member here now. I know some of the King Edward's folk are shocked by that. He's a wonderful English teacher. He's been a housemaster, and we really appreciate your love and care for the Quail family today, sir. To the Quail family, thank you for giving us the honor of hosting this memorial service at our school. To all at Squash South Africa, the many tributes you received, the JP community, the Old Boys Association, the Pipe Band, who was one of David Quail's more treasured parts of his JP history and will pay an honor in a few minutes. The choir, the JP boys, of course, to Sharon Elms and Kerry Ann Feller in particular, who put so much work into today's preparation to help the Quail family, and of course to the JP staff who prepared the hall. In closing, I wrote what I suppose could be called a poem. Perhaps my English teacher and our colleague Colette Rattray will correct me later on what this actually is. So please forgive me a little bit of creativity as I was inspired by the great life of David Quail. It's called If I Had Tea with Quail One Last Time. If I had tea with you one last time, headmaster to headmaster, I would not speak much. I think I would listen. I would tell you this, though. You gave your life to the school, not in headlines or grand gestures, but in days and decisions, and the courage to hold the line when it would have been easier to bend. You shaped JP in ways you would not even begin to understand. Its character is your character. Its spine is your spine. You wanted a school that would better serve a united South Africa. I'm certain you would be proud of what you see now. You were loved, you were respected, and yes, at times you were feared, which was exactly what the JP boys needed then and still need now. You accepted no standard but the highest, not because it was fashionable, but because it was right. Some will call it old-fashioned. The manners, the integrity, the discipline, the insistence that no boy is bigger than the school. We call it JP, and we will not relent on those values. We will honor your legacy, not with words alone, but with standards kept, values lived, and courage shown when it costs. 14-year-old Difficilius, Mr. Quail, your old school will not forget you, because in so many ways you never actually left. Thank you very much. May I ask you to stand for the pipe band who will be doing a rendition of Amazing Grace.